a year ago. In some ways, it's a bittersweet memory, those of you who were here. Now, if you don't mind my asking, I'm always curious, how many of you were here a year ago for this? Oh my goodness, many of you. Well, it is a blessing, a huge blessing for me to be part of what is happening here. And I think some of you may know that tonight we're going to honor Cardinal Dolan. But tonight's dinner wouldn't be possible without some sponsors, specifically and chiefly the Acton Institute. Some of you are aware of the work of the Acton Institute. They're a, I was going to say vicious right-wing organization. I don't know if that's out of line, but they are. And I've had the privilege to be affiliated with them in my own vicious right-wing activities. They invited me to speak at the Acton University, which was, I guess, last summer, an amazing, absolutely an extraordinary experience on the banks of the Grand River in Grand Rapids. But then I was again invited to speak at their annual fundraising dinner, which I think was in October. What a joy to get to know them. And I travel around this country and I get more and more encouraged. I see what God is doing. You feel like you're hearing someone say, 7,000 have not yet bowed the knee to Baal. They're out there, and I keep getting to meet them. And the Acton Institute, they are heroes. Did you not get that reference? Okay. I know. I forget. It's very biblically illiterate. I keep forgetting. In New York, they would have gotten it just like that. But no, maybe in Dallas. But in all seriousness, to know that there are people out there and organizations out there doing heroic work, just tremendous work. And the Acton Institute, obviously, is one of them. So I want to now introduce Brett Elder, who's with the Acton Institute, who will share a few thoughts.
Thank you, Eric. The Acton Institute, for the last 8 years, has put on Acton University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And just to give you a taste of what Acton University is about, this year we'll enjoy about 850 people who will be attending from about 70 countries, and we're exploring together the foundations of freedom. We're looking forward to that time together as we do every year, and would love to have any and all of you there. I presume many of you have been there. We certainly have a lot of centurions that teach some of the courses. I think there are 100 courses and 55 lecturers. We are honored tonight at the Acton Institute to be able to sponsor this dinner and just be part of the honoring of Cardinal Dolan. And we certainly have shared a kinship with Prison Fellowship Ministries and Chuck Colson and the Colson Center over the last, Acton's been in existence for 23 years, and certainly the vast majority of those years we've had a strong partnership, and so we're grateful for the partnership we have. The Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty, we have an abiding interest in that study and intersection of faith and freedom. And we focus specifically on the study of faith and the free economy, as we believe it's inextricably linked to our economic freedoms are linked certainly to our religious freedoms. And so in that partnership with Prison Fellowship, we have participated in Doing the Right Thing curriculum. That's an awesome curriculum that Prison Fellowship put out. And there are a couple of products and resources that I want to call your attention to that the Acton Institute has recently put out that also invokes some of the names and personalities of Prison Fellowship staff here. The first one I want to call your attention to is a book called Rooted and Grounded. And Rooted and Grounded is a book by Abraham Kuyper. And most of you, if not all of you, know who Abraham Kuyper is and the formative, some of the formative thinking, certainly of people in this room. We have the privilege of translating some of Abraham Kuyper's works from Dutch into English. And Rooted and Grounded is sort of a taste of things to come. So we all know about the every square inch quote, which is a profound quote. But this book actually talks a little bit about Kuyper's thoughts on how the church is to engage in every square inch. And so this is the church on organization and institution. If you were at the Centurion breakfast, you got this. If you did not, we probably have a copy for a good number of us at the Acton Institute table near the elevator, if you want to get that as you leave. Two other things, very quickly. In the middle of your table is a book that looks remarkably like this. And the introduction to this book was written by our very own Jim Liskey, and it is called Faithful in All God's House. One of the quotes that Lord Acton is most famous for saying, besides power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, is that liberty is not the power of doing what we like, but the right to do what we ought. And it's that ought that the Acton Institute is certainly about, as this prison fellowship. And Faithful in God's House provides a great overview of God's grand economic design for life and how we ought to interact in that design. And finally, what I want you to do is, that looks like a centerpiece on your table, but it's actually a book, and it reads just like one. So someone needs to take it, not leave it on the table like that last piece of bread that nobody wanted to take. If there's a fight that breaks out, we also have a few other copies, not enough for everyone, but certainly quite a few at the booth as well. And finally, I want to mention to you a brand new curriculum that's just released. And very thankful to Jim Liskey for hosting this 7-part series called Our Great Exchange. Your life, His gifts, our purpose. And this series is a 7-part series that asks perhaps one of the more profound questions. If every square inch is God's, why would God entrust us with the management responsibility for His design for life? Why would He do that? And so this is an exploration of stewardship that really speaks to the issue of why would God entrust His resources into our care. Jim Liskey hosts this, and he does a remarkable job, just brilliantly guiding us through the journey. And I'm not just saying that because you're sitting at the table next to me, but maybe that'll get me a cup of coffee next time you're in town. Okay. Our Great Exchange also features in the 4th lesson a 10-minute story of Chuck Colson, perhaps his last extensive interview, and it is just very well edited. I would encourage you all to get a copy, and again, we have a few at the table. But we are grateful for the opportunity to sponsor this tonight, and look forward to the rest of the evening with you.
Thank you, Brett. Well, again, just a joy and a privilege to be here, to see so many friends all together in the room for such a great, grand occasion. I want to share with you a little bit about William Wilberforce, just by coincidence. No, I thought it might be appropriate. We thought it might be appropriate, and it will be appropriate. But before I really get into Wilberforce, let me say that, let me say this. How do I know who Wilberforce is, and why did I write a book on Wilberforce, a biography called Amazing Grace? I heard about Wilberforce, as I seem to have heard about hundreds of great things, first through a guy named Chuck Colson. That's what happens when you're brilliant and godly and have wide influence. I can hardly remember what it was that I heard through Chuck and didn't hear through Chuck. So much of my early formation as a Christian came from reading Chuck's books, and then the footnotes to Chuck's books, and one of those things for sure was this guy named Wilberforce. I remember even when I worked with Chuck at Breakpoint, I went to this Wilberforce dinner. I don't know who was being honored back then. It was either Michael Novak or somebody, but just I kept hearing about Wilberforce, and of course, finally wrote my own book on Wilberforce. Similarly with Bonhoeffer, I heard in part about Bonhoeffer through Chuck, and I'm saying all this before I tell you more specifically about Wilberforce, that I have a book coming out, I think not tomorrow, but Monday. It's launching, called, we would never launch a book on the Sabbath, obviously. What are we, pagans? Come on. And thank you. And But the title of the book is Seven Men, and I wrote it because I feel like there's a crisis of manhood in the culture. We can hardly talk about what is a man, what is a great man. We don't talk about that, but I thought that we need to talk about that. What are we teaching our young men about what they might aspire to? Who are the role models we're offering them? We've denigrated the very idea of role models and heroes, and you all know this. But anyway, so I wrote this book called Seven Men, which is coming out on Monday, and when I found out that Patty Colson would be here, I wanted to be the first to say publicly with her that the seventh man in this book, there's Wilberforce and Bonhoeffer, of course, George Washington, Eric Liddell from Chariots of Fire, Jackie Robinson, Carol Wojtyła. Ringing any bells? Yes. John Paul II, the Great, is here. But the seventh man is my friend and hero, Chuck Colson. And I just wanted to share that. And I'm going to get choked up, so stop applauding. I tell you, really, I'm so thrilled that I was able to do that. And that's one of the few things, the upside of somebody passing away, is that I wouldn't have put any living people in this book. And when Chuck was on his deathbed a little bit more than a year ago, I remember thinking, that's it. Chuck is number 7. And you'll be happy to know that he bumped Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. And Lincoln is ticked. Don't put it past him. He was very ambitious. Don't believe this Honest Abe stuff. But it just gives me great joy, and I would normally be more uncomfortable promoting my own book, except Alan Terwilliger told me that the Colson Center is going to make money if you buy copies. There are copies out here. So, of course, I will sign them at no cost. But just had to mention that. What a personal joy, Emily and Patty, to be able to say that Chuck is the seventh man, and so many people are going to read about the great things that he did. So I want to say that. But Wilberforce. There's a lot to Wilberforce. In the movie about Wilberforce, Amazing Grace, and I'm assuming that maybe most of you saw the movie. The movie is directed by a secular director, right? That's, Walden Media wanted to be very careful and not to make it too Christian. Unfortunately, they succeeded. So they hired Michael Apted, who's done other stuff. And, I would speak publicly and always praise the film, and it's a good film, just like 42 is a good film. But I have to say that they really did not get into the extraordinary faith of William Wilberforce. And most of the men in my book here, it's a similar thing. Jackie Robinson's the same thing. The movie barely touches on the faith. And we're so hungry for any expressions or mentions of faith that we just think, oh, that's great, it's a Christian movie. But when you consider that not only was faith a much larger part of these people's lives, the same thing with Johnny Cash, the biopic Walk the Line. You watch it and you think, well, what motivated, for example, Johnny Cash to turn away from drugs? And it was, let me just sum it up. Jesus Christ, that's it. But that's nowhere in the movie. 42, sort of touches on it. Amazing Grace sort of touches on it. But when we're talking about William Wilberforce, we have to understand that, and obviously in my book, Amazing Grace, I go into all of this stuff, but the story of Wilberforce is a man who, he never would have done any of what he did without his profound faith in Jesus Christ. There have been statesmen and great men and who didn't have that faith. But if you're going to study Wilberforce and talk about Wilberforce, you cannot divorce the man from his faith. He wasn't a good guy who did good stuff. He was a crummy sinner who got saved by grace, and the Lord opens his eyes, and suddenly he sees the universe with the eyes of God and sees that the slave trade is an abomination and I must take a stand. Now, he may even have seen that it was an abomination before, but to take that heroic stand, it seems pretty clear that he could not have done that without a profound living faith, because what he went through, as most of you know if you saw the movie, it was anyone would have fallen by the wayside. How do you keep going? But if you know that God has called you to this battle, it changes everything, and it must change everything. But it doesn't just change, how hard you fight. I mean, it does do that, and we need to take into account that this is a guy who went back over and over and over again because he knew the battle belongs to the Lord. That's not a cliche. It's not a nice idea. It is true. It's not our job to win. It's our job to be obedient. to be obedient. And then the results are in God's hands. That's kind of freeing, don't you think? It's really the only way to live, that you know that God wants me to do the right thing, but it's up to him who wins. Now, in the story of Bonhoeffer, for example, ostensibly he doesn't win. He's killed by the Nazis. But it's not about winning. It's about obedience. And Wilberforce, again, when we're talking about Wilberforce, we have to remember that this is a man whose faith made him see what others didn't see, and then prepared him to carry forward on this great battle that God had called him to. So his faith, first of all, gives him the persistence to go through the long haul. Because if you can only imagine, in my book I talk about how some of the votes were so close, so heartbreaking, it would have just crushed a lesser man. But he knew that if this is God's battle, I'm just going to keep going, and God will give us the victory. And of course, God did give him the victory in the slave trade, finally in 1807. But it's all the more sweet when you realize that this man, he would have just kept fighting anyway. You do the right thing. You do the right thing. And so when we're talking about a Wilberforce Award, you have to realize that Wilberforce's faith was absolutely at the very heart of what he did. And also, to flip it, Wilberforce wasn't just a man of faith in the ethereal sense, in the pietistic sense. He was a man of action, meaning that he believed that God calls me to live my faith out in the world, not just to be someone who talks about it or thinks about it. This is, particularly among evangelical types, that we think we're saved by the statement of faith on the website of our church, that's the fig leaf that's going to fool God, that, what do you believe? I believe in all these things, and they're all right, so I'm in, thank you. And God is not fooled. If it's not lived out in your life, then you actually don't believe those things. So if you define faith by, believing things intellectually, God's not fooled by that. God really, he's been around since before the Enlightenment and all that hyper-rationalistic stuff. And so he's not fooled by the idea that, you believe this and this and this, well, yeah, okay, I have to let you in. And Wilberforce was one of those men who lived out his faith. And it was clear in all that he did. And in case you don't know, and this, usually when I give talks on Wilberforce, I talk about, the Wilberforce, the rest of the story, to use the Paul Harvey line, that you've heard about the slave trade, but the everything else, that if God removes the blinders from your eyes so that you see what he sees, then the brokenness of that culture, the worst part of it was the slave trade, but there was a host of other horrors, that there was tremendously sick child labor that you can't imagine, 200 years ago, little children were working 12 hours in dangerous conditions. There was rampant alcoholism that makes the crack epidemic of the 80s look like nothing. I mean, this went on for decades and decades and decades, that the poor were addicted to gin, the rich were addicted to claret, people were publicly drunken, there was drunkenness on the floor of Parliament, and on and on. Just a tremendous level of brokenness. Wilberforce saw all those things, and as virtually the only serious Christian in Parliament at the time, in politics, because it was believed falsely that, to find God means to call you out of the Egypt of politics or anything, and that you've got to go into the ministry. And Wilberforce realized, after he talked to John Newton, that no, that's not true. That God may be calling me to serve him in that dirty world of politics, that he can use me in that. And so he touched everything, and it opened all kinds of opportunities. And so it led him to do so much. But it has to be said that Wilberforce's faith also led him to fight differently, right? He loved his enemies, and that's a novel idea. You perhaps haven't heard of that. I think it's a Buddhist idea. That crazy idea to love your enemies, unless you know Jesus is Lord, why would anybody do anything so ridiculous unless you know there's more to it? It's one of those great mysteries that Jesus calls us to love our enemies, because apart from him, we would be one of those enemies. We would be on the other side of the abortion issue, the other side of the marriage issue. We would, apart from the grace of God. So it's a completely different perspective to say, I will fight with passion, as Wilberforce did against abolition and against the slave trade and against so many things, but I will do it in such a way that those people who are my political enemies will see more than just William Wilberforce. They will be forced perhaps to see God standing behind me, who's a lot scarier than me, a lot bigger. And they will not just see some partisan ideologue, but they'll see somebody fighting in a way that it will embarrass them with its civility and graciousness. And God calls us, and the model of Wilberforce instructs us to fight that way. It's a different way of fighting, loving our enemies as we're fighting them. We don't say we have no enemies. Somebody on that side of the abortion issue, whatever, we must fight, but we must fight differently. That's the story of Wilberforce. Wilberforce also had, as I think the most serious Christians always must, a very profound ecumenism. He was not, he didn't not care about theology, but there was more to it. He would work with his enemies. He would work with people with whom he disagreed theologically, because he realized that if I really care about those who are suffering, if I care about the slaves, then I've got to work with some of these people. So he worked with all kinds of people politically who, had he been a Pharisee, a legalist, and said, well, I'm not going to even break bread with those people, I'm not going to, well then, first of all, he would have missed God, but he would have been much less effective in doing what he did. So there's a real grace and winsomeness in wanting to do that. I think that's another place where Chuck inspired me so profoundly in his Evangelicals and Catholics Together, for which he took so much heat and for which he so heroically labored. He was doing something that it's clear that he was being prophetic, that he saw that in a secular culture, the idea that we will focus on our differences when we have so much work to do together to the glory of Jesus Christ, it's an absurdity. But you really need to be heroic to see that and to live that out. Chuck did. And it seems clear to me that Wilberforce did, that he worked with people across the spectrum, with atheists, with Quakers, with Methodists, with Anglicans, with nominal Anglican bishops, and so on and so forth. He would think what he would think, but he said, I will work with them because I care about the slaves. I care about the people who are suffering. These are all qualities that are worth understanding when we think about Wilberforce. Wilberforce also was brave. He was a voice in the culture. Last year, we called the weekend the Spiral of Silence Conference. The Spiral of Silence, Chuck, as he always would do, would find some obscure German sociologist and, dust off this idea. That's a great idea. Let's get that on Breakpoint. And sort of popularize this idea. And the idea of breaking the spiral of silence, it's a profound idea, and I refer to it constantly now because it has to do with the idea that we're caught in a spiral of silence, that if I don't speak up and you don't speak up, it becomes harder and harder to speak up. So somebody has to break the spiral of silence and speak up. And there's never been a clearer case of that than the redefinition of marriage in our time. Have you ever seen anything move so swiftly? I mean, 20 years ago, it was an insane absurdity that nobody would even admit to having thought. And then something happened, and something happened, and something happened. And now, to voice anything against it, even the most winsome way, is you're charged with bigotry of some kind. This is in America. This is in America. And I think that the bravery, the courage that it takes to speak up, I think it's pretty tough to do unless you know God is with you, unless He gives you the heart and the grace to do it in the right way. You can't do it. But Wilberforce was a lonely voice at first. And this is the thing, too, today. If you're talking to sort of young Christians, it's very sexy to be involved in the, anti-sex trafficking or the slave trade, the modern-day slave. There are all these things which, I'll do that. But what about same-sex marriage? Are you talking about that, with your hipster friends? Are you bringing that up? No, because there's a price. Well, do you realize that in Wilberforce's day, bringing up the slave trade was like bringing that up? It took courage. So that 200 years later, everybody says, well, of course, slavery is wrong. What are you kidding? Of course. Well, no, not of course. It took bravery. We need to understand that's real leadership, is playing to the audience of one, which is to say God. So that's a little bit about Wilberforce that maybe you weren't so clear on, I hope. I hope you are now. But as you know, we're here tonight to honor a man who exemplifies the values of the great William Wilberforce. And before we transition to the awards ceremony, which we will in a few minutes. We're going to hear from his colleague, Father Jonathan Morris, who'll tell us a little bit about Cardinal Dolan. You know Jonathan Morris, of course, from Fox News. Not that any of us in here watches that trash. You understand, this is a PBS crowd. This is a PBS crowd. We're not going to watch that crazy Fox stuff. But if we did, we know that you're the sole voice of reason on that channel. And Father Jonathan, if you would come up here and share some of your thoughts, we'd appreciate that.